Hello and welcome to another edition of Professor Speaks. Today we're going to be talking about how drugs are priced by insurance companies. But before we get into that, I'd like to remind you to hit subscribe and hit the little bell for notifications. Hello and welcome to another edition of Professor Speaks. My name is Alex Hernandez. Alongside me as always is Dr. Craig Stern. And today we're going to be talking about how drugs are priced by insurance companies. Now, the reason why we brought this topic up was because there are doctors that we talk to on a daily basis. We talk to doctors, we talk to pharmacists, and we talk to regular patients as well. And they all come up with a question about how these drugs are being priced by insurance companies. So, Dr. Stern, if you can, what is the system that one has to go through when a patient is going to the pharmacy and a drug is being dispensed and they're being told the price?
Right. Let's talk historically real quick. And that is, in the past, somebody went to a pharmacy. Pharmacies in general priced it however they wanted to price it. Frequently use something called a San Gabriel chart that had their profit built into it. When health plans, especially when Medicare came in and more issues came in with regard to Medicare, Medicare Part D, and even before that, managed care came in the early 70s, 1970s. The issue was that the insurers, employers, the federal government, state governments didn't want to pay retail. They wanted to pay wholesale. So the question was, what would they do? And so they established prices that were discounts instead of the price plus. This was discounts. And so what they did is they took a basis of cost, they called it average wholesale price, AWP, and said, we're going to pay a discount off of that, like 15% off of AWP. AWP was supposed to be a wholesale price. So as I indicated, they moved from paying retail to wholesale. And now they're going to pay a discount off of wholesale. In the case of generics, that was for branded drugs. In the case of generic drugs, they followed a rule that Medicare had established, and that was they made something called a maximum allowable cost. We know about that because we analyze them, we audit them, we even have established custom MAC lists for clients, etc., so that all the money can flow to them and remove all the middleman fees. But the maximum allowable cost was established in order to ensure that the employers, the plans, the federal government, state governments didn't pay more than that particular fee. And the federal government had established, it was in the Federal Register, that fee was going to be the average of the three lowest AWP prices. So there was a discount that you paid for brand, there was a maximum allowable cost that you paid for generics, and between that then, that was the price that was paid.
And all of this is happening behind closed doors. I mean, this is behind the scenes where pharmacies trying to establish what kind of reimbursement they get.
Yes.
And make sure the drug manufacturers still get their profits for their drug as well.
Right. Now the thing changed when Walmart started it, and then it spread to everybody.
When more competition got.
More competition was there, and they said, look, let's look at generics. If you look at generics, there are a lot of cheaper generics that have been on the market a long time.
Right.
And we're going to establish these discount generic fee schedules, or what's commonly known as $4 lists. And they said, we're going to charge you no more than $4 for a month's prescription of these drugs. Okay. What it did is it brought people into the pharmacies. They were willing to wait for a little while they shopped for other things, groceries or whatever goods that were available.
Which makes sense.
Made sense.
Yeah.
And so in that regard, pharmacy was taking control back from the plans, from pharmacy benefit managers who had made money off of the differential. They made money off of AWP because AWP was frequently inflated and it wasn't truly a cost. They made money off of the MAC list because there was spread about what the plan paid and what was paid to the pharmacy. Middlemen fees were accepted. PBMs got those fees. Health plans sometimes got those fees, etc. for it. So there was already that. And now the pharmacies took control and said, no, your copay may be $10 for a generic, but we'll give you the drug for $4.
Okay.
And so in that regard, pharmacies were taking control back, and that also led to a problem that is occurring today and was just approved by some Senate committees, and that was in all of the contracts, there was something known as a gag clause. And the gag clause said, I'm a pharmacist, I'm dispensing drugs to you. I can't tell you that if you paid cash, you could get it for a lower amount.
Wow.
And so if you had a prescription and I could give it to you for $4 if you paid cash, I couldn't say that you would pay your $10 copay, and that in that regard you were paying more for the drugs than you would have paid if you had bought it for cash and paid $4. So that changed the dynamic of what was going on. There was also a dynamic where there were different players in the marketplace, and there's been several articles recently about plans and PBMs and others trying to restrict the market so that you get those people who, if you will, are playing ball, that are effectively following the rules of whatever your plan contract is, but others who are willing to give a discount, but they're not showing up as well in the contract. So there's been issues with regard to restricted networks. Either way, the way that you pay for drugs was established under certain formulas, but those formulas have aged, and those formulas now have opportunities for savings on standard drugs. It doesn't change some of the more expensive specialty drugs that cost in excess of $1,500 a dose, but it certainly does for standard drugs that people take all the time for high blood pressure, for diabetes, for cholesterol, things like that.
And it doesn't change because specialty, there's limited availability for those, right?
Well, the availability for specialty drugs is either pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, that own their own specialty drugs, and clearly they're running it for a profit, no question about it. Or it comes from a retail pharmacy, also doing it for a profit and trying to do it as a niche because they've got more ability to price it than they do with some of the standard drugs.
Right.
Or it comes from certain non-public or private kind of specialty entities that are putting them out there, and they're all competing. The difference in drugs today is that as more and more people enter, there's more competition over price.
Right.
And so while people will argue that, well, there's a restricted distribution for some drugs where the manufacturer works a deal with the pharmacy and they're the only ones who can dispense it, and usually big ones, because you can't do it for one small area, or only one small area gets the drug, and you have a particular disease, cystic fibrosis or some kidney problem or otherwise, you can't get it. So it has to be national, but it's limited in who can do it. As more people come into the market, it's more there and there's more competition, which leads us to another formula. And the other formula is Medicare established a formula for drugs that were injectable drugs.
Okay.
There's two kinds of injectable drugs. There's self-injectable drugs where you get a drug like insulin, for example, and you take your blood sugar in the morning or whenever, and you give yourself a shot of insulin. There's also injectable drugs that you don't give to yourself, that a nurse gives to you or a doctor gives to you, like in an infusion center or an emergency room or an urgent care center or the doctor's office. And Medicare established a principle for that. They also had a baseline price, because that's always the issue. What's the baseline price? In this particular regard, they do a survey, and it's called the average sales price. And they attack that problem by saying, we will pay this average sales price plus 6%, so 106% of ASP, and that's what you're going to pay. So each of them has a formula, but as time goes on, the marketplace begins to be more commoditized, more competitive. issues where you can buy the drugs cheaper, and
Well,
as a result of that,
it
you do
should,
it.
because everything else in our nation's economy started off as a niche and then grew and then
Yes.
became more competitive, and the prices go down and it becomes more consumer based.
Yes.
The reason why drugs is so different compared to other whatever business goods that we have in our nation is prices are going up.
Well,
And especially with specialty prices. I mean, we've been in this business. You've been in it for a long time. I've been in it for over 10 years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So much. I'm very young. Don't listen to me.
But when I first came in, it was generic drugs, brand drugs, and then the last couple of years, it's specialty. So some of the specialty designations for like Hep C, so some of those drug prices went up astronomically, and it's alarming, but it's also it's very concerning for a lot of patients that depend on them.
Well, realize that what's going on with specialty is that on one level, no one is going to the manufacturer and saying, here's the cap, you can't price anything more than this. Nothing.
Because
Okay?
they're the supplier.
They do sell it, and clearly there's competition, and people in volume try and get a lower price. No surprise by that. It
Right.
happens in every industry, right?
Right.
But in the pharmacy industry, different from hospitals where their prices are capped, different from doctors where their prices are capped, and different from pharmacies, as we just talked about,
Yep.
where their prices are capped at a discount for brand and MAC for generic. Now specialty doesn't have a cap. So they can charge $84,000 for a new drug for Hep C. And the argument is, unless there's competition, there is no reason to lower that, aside from this argument that's gone on between manufacturers and PBMs about who's responsible for the cost increase in drugs.
And who's going to be more transparent first and all that.
And that's a separate subject.
Right.
But clearly, everybody is involved in this one way or the other. But either way, as more competition enters the market, and there are more drugs in that category, then you begin to have price competition between the different drugs. And as a result of that, some formularies restrict some of the more expensive ones and keep you to exactly the same category, the same drug, but a lower cost. So they do that.
Right.
Clearly, we analyze those kind of things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there's this issue that not only do you have competition because you have a lot of drugs in that category, but you also have competition because the drugs themselves presumably have a value, and then the question is, do they all have the same value? Hence the new contracts that are coming out that say, we'll pay if the drug has value, but if the drug doesn't have value, if it doesn't lower your blood pressure enough, doesn't deal with your diabetes enough, doesn't deal with your cholesterol enough, then we're not going to pay for that. We want drugs that are going to actually do what they say they're going to do and deal with it. Examples of that, for example, current Alzheimer's drugs deal with certain symptoms, but they don't take somebody who has Alzheimer's or dementia and turn them into a fully cognitive individual. They don't do that.
It kind of like manages.
Well, one argument is that they're slowing the progression. Whether that's true or not is not entirely clear. But what is clear is that when you look at it on a scale of taking a little test, some people do better, but it doesn't make people feel that automatically they're going to feel better, they're going to be able to function, they're going to be able to do the activities of daily living. That's not what these drugs do. And so until there are agents that actively stop the progression and begin to reverse some of the symptomatology, then we'll see some issues. And that's happening with some specialty drugs today.
Well, some of these drug manufacturers might not be looking value in the same way.
That's right.
Their value might be, how long will a patient be on this drug? Will this patient be on it long term? Maybe that drug will have more value. If that patient is on it short term, maybe not so much value.
Well, one of the arguments today is if you deal with value because you're trying to lower cost,
Right.
is that you take a look at value and you say, well, what's value?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's got a different definition of that. Almost all of the definitions include less emergency room visits, less hospital visits, and less length of stay. Almost all of them have some of that in it.
Right.
Then the issue is, what about the other clinical impacts of it that are not just whether you're having an extreme or an urgent event,
Right.
but rather what are you doing in order to truly ensure that the person's risk over the long term has been reduced, that their clinical markers have come down. That's where the argument is about where things are. Bottom line argument for cost, since we're talking about cost, is that if you have value, then you're willing to pay, perhaps you're willing to pay a premium for it, but if something else doesn't have that same value, you don't want to pay for that, and you certainly don't want to pay any premium for it.
Right, of course. But and then we'll circle it back now to the insurance companies and like how they price these drugs is they most of the time they'll offer up a list, right? They'll offer it to their network of doctors, and they'll say these are the drugs that we're gonna pay for, and your patient will pay a certain copay or if any, right? So that list you mentioned is brought up how when we were talking about generic lists. How do they look at that list?
Well, the overall list is the formulary.
Right.
People tend to look at that and say, oh, the formulary's bad, they don't let me get the drug that my doctor has prescribed,
Right.
etc.
And for you guys at home, formulary is a list brought to the networks of doctors by the insurance company.
And pharmacy benefit managers,
PBMs.
etc.
Yeah.
And some employers. The formulary has branded drugs on it. It has generic drugs on it. Almost every formulary, certainly the formularies we've designed and certainly those that we analyze, have a generic bias, meaning try the generic before you try any brand, because the generic in general costs about a fifth of what a brand drug costs.
Right.
So you could get, in general, you could get 5 generic prescriptions for every branded prescription that you're getting. Not specialty, but standard. Those lists are, while they are very controversial and questions come up about them, they're put together by professionals, doctors, pharmacists, nurses, some administrative people, and in some cases a lay public, that look at the drugs and say, which of these has a value and has a competitive cost, removing those that do not have a competitive cost, and keeping those that have value. They lower your blood pressure, they lower your blood sugar, actually work, and they do what they're supposed to do,
Right.
and competitively, there's some of the lower cost products that do exactly the same thing as everybody else.
Right.
So while there's an argument about it, those lists include brand, generic, what's known as multisource, or drugs that have a brand and a generic, some over-the-counter drugs, etc. They're all there, and specialty, by the way, is frequently included in those lists today too.
Some of the lower end specialty, most of the time.
Well, if there's only one drug to treat something, then it's hard to have a formulary that's going to exclude anything, because that should be on the formulary. On the other hand, if there are several drugs that treat that, like now today with hepatitis C, there's at least a half a dozen drugs, perhaps more, that are treating hepatitis C. Now there's competition between the drugs as to how effective they are, which of the genotypes are they treating, what the comparative cost is, etc. And then, of course, all this argument about rebates and cost, etc. But from the physician, from the patient, from everyone who looks at this, there are established formulas, and as gag clauses are removed, the fundamental question is always is there a lower cost for me to pay? Is there a generic for me to pay? In the case of specialty, is the biosimilar there for me to pay?
Right.
So that in general, I have something that I can try and counter this system of standards until the standards change. in order to try and come up with better ways to buy the drug.
And one of the things you mentioned with this gag clause, it's shocking to me that it even existed. How does pharmacists were kept from actually telling the patient they would pay less if they were to just pay cash?
Yes, that was part of the legal standard and could not be evaded for what went on. There's a host of reasons for it. Some of it good reasons, some of it not very good reasons for what went on. But it happened before there were issues where there was more competition in order to lower some of these costs. Now that there is competition, now there's an opportunity for people to be able to say, I want to pay less.
And we do want our pharmacies to be able to communicate more, not being held back from what they can and cannot say to a patient.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One caveat, one really important caveat is that not just pharmacies, doctors, but health plans look at the data in order to see, are we doing an optimal job in protecting people and lowering their risk? And so even if you pay cash, what you want them to do is to put that into your profile and make sure that that profile is general, meaning that it goes on the computer, not just the computer in the pharmacy, but the general insurance computer, because then all doctors can see what you're taking, all pharmacists can see what you're taking, and nurses in some cases, nurse practitioners for sure, can see, so that there's a complete profile so someone can see. If you walk in and you just pay $4, you take the drug and you go away, no one in general knows you're on that drug. So the really important issue for all healthcare professionals to know is make sure that it's entered on your general insurance profile so that everybody knows what you're taking. $4, $100, everybody knows what it is.
And it's not like it will affect your insurance at all, because it's important for doctors to know, because you can avoid complications with any other drugs that might interact in a negative way with whatever you're paying for.
Yes, absolutely.
So it is very important to communicate, as we've stressed this on many episodes, where you just talking to your pharmacist and talking to your doctor is extremely important, and being open. There is a circle of trust, and within that circle of trust is your pharmacist and your doctor. And any other things you want to share?
No, I think it's really important. If people have questions about costs, feel free to send us emails on this. Em picks all of this up and we try and respond to everything. But we also talk about on Pharmacy Benefit News, which is kind of our blog that we put out every 2 weeks, and you can read it there as well.
Right. And we'll also have producer M. We'll make sure that she posts up links to there are 2 or 3 different sites that has drug comparison sheets where you have True Med Cost and GoodRx, where you can find the cheapest drug in the area that you're living in and what pharmacy it's at. And and that's all for today. Yeah. And thank you very much, Dr. Stern.
Thank you.
And we will see you again next week. I'd like to remind you to go to ProPharmaConsultants.com and look for our PBN, as Dr. Stern was talking about. We have Pharmacy Benefit News available for you at all times. And also, I'd like to remind you to hit like, subscribe, and hit the little bell for notifications.